Welcome to part 1 of my walkthrough of Node.js and Express.js. In part 1, I'm going to show how to install the Express generator and use it to initialize an empty project. And then I'm going to take you on a tour of the generated code and explain all of the things that have been generated and what their role is in the application. In part 2, I'll go on to actually extend that generated application to add new routes, new views, and even a new API service, so you can see how you can create all of the things that you need to create a web application. Okay, let's start out by installing the Express generator. So we're just going to use npm to do a global install of the Express generator. And that's actually going to install a command line executable called Express in your path. So actually now we can just type Express, and those are the options that are available. In this case, I'm going to do this little demo with the handlebars engine. So to do that, we just do Express, and we're going to say HBS for handlebars, and I'm just going to specify the Express HBS as the folder. So that's all it takes to actually get one started. So if we do a dir, now we can see, okay, it created a directory for that. Okay, now I'm using Powershell instead of command prompt. So if you're doing that too, then you're actually going to have problems trying to use these commands that the Express generator output for you, because these commands won't be parsed correctly in PowerShell. So I'm going to show you how to do these in PowerShell. The first thing you need to do is change into the directory, and then npm install is going to restore all of the packages that the scaffolded project specified for you. So the first thing you're going to find is that PowerShell isn't going to like that double ampersand there. So the difference is, instead, we're just going to do semicolon. Now, before I proceed, let me just explain what's happening, because even if you use the command prompt, you might not recognize double ampersand. What that means is perform the left side command, and then if it succeeds, then perform the right side command. So that's how you can supply like a sequential chain of commands in the command prompt without having to do one, enter, then the other one. And what I've entered here in PowerShell does exactly the same thing. So we can see now it's spinning around here while it installs all the stuff that you need. Alright, so now we have all of the packages that we needed to have installed. Alright, the next thing that was up here was saying to set debug equal to this expression, and I'll explain what that does a little bit later. And then once that's done, run the server using npm start. That's not the only way you can start it, but that's the way that this project is set up to run. So now the way that you're going to set an environment variable is also different in PowerShell. So if you have never done this before, the way you actually do it, environment variables are actually like a drive in PowerShell. So you can actually dir them with env, like that. You could actually even cd there. But we're just going to go back. But from there you could actually work with entries in the environment as if they were files, kind of. Alright, but in order to set an environment variable, you have to do it like this. So you do a $env, and then you put the value that you want to assign, equals, and then quote. And then in this case it was express HBS : star, like that. And then again, it was an ampersand and npm start, so you just do it like this. Alright, so this output that you're starting to see here is actually because debug is set to this expression. Debug controls the behavior of the debug module, which is being used by this scaffolded application to actually output diagnostic information to the standard out so that you can see it and see what's going on in the application. So if I were to open up a tab, and we'll just go to localhost, oops, like that. Alright, so there is your sample app, and we'll show the code that goes behind there in a minute, but you can see that we're getting a few little bits of diagnostic info down here that's coming from debug. Alright, that wraps up this section. In the next section, we're going to start looking at the code in Visual Studio Code and take a look at what's already there, and then I'll show how to extend it a little bit. Alright, I've opened the source code of the project in Visual Studio Code, and I've started by looking at the package.json file, which is where I'm going to start walking you through the code in here. Just take a quick look at the Explorer on the left-hand side over here. So we got a bin folder with one file into it. Got a public folder, and that's where by default it serves all of the, as you can see, images, scripts, and styles from. It's got a routes folder, which we'll explore later, and a views folder, which we'll also explore later. So let's start our exploration by looking at package.json. As you'll remember, we started running the server by typing npm start, and the way that npm figures out what to do when you type npm start is it looks in the package.json file for this element here under script start. So it's going to turn around and execute the file in bin/dub with Node. So let's go there and see what it looks like. Alright, so let me start breaking this down. If you're a Windows developer, you may not be familiar with what this first line is up here. This first line in the Linux world is called a hashbang or a shebang, and it's what scripts use to kind of tell the shell environment how to interpret the rest of the contents of the file. This is here kind of more for legacy purposes in Node. It kind of can be used in a Linux environment, but it has absolutely no use in a Windows environment. But Node, when you execute a file with Node and it sees a line like this, it just ignores it. So it's not valid JavaScript, but it is valid in Node. Alright, so if we just kind of go down the file here, you can see you've got, it's going to load app. I mentioned in my blog series that Node uses the CommonJS module pattern. So these are synchronous requires, and they load the file at the path that you specify synchronously and then return. So this is going to load app, and this is where the guts of Express configuration really starts. So I'm going to delve into that next, because that's kind of where you start going down the rabbit hole. But first I kind of want to stay a bit more on the surface and just look at the rest of this file, because there's really not a whole lot to it. On this next line here, you can see that it's requiring the debug module, and the debug module is a package on npm. It's not a core module, but the way that it works is you load it with require, and it exports a function. That's why you have another set of parens immediately after it, and this function takes the the identifier of the module that this instance of debug is actually going to output diagnostic information for. And then the way that it works is when you then call, this function invocation returns a further function, and then when you call that function, what it's going to do is it's going to, when whatever environment it's running in, it's either going to output like the whatever you pass into that function as like output to the console, or if you have not set up your environment to output that particular piece of debug information, then it's a no-op, meaning it's a function that just does nothing. So this is actually a really nice way for you to be able to embed diagnostic output into your app and to be able to control it from a environment variable, so you can turn on and off different parts of the app that you actually want to see diagnostic output for, as like an alternative to implementing, for example, logging levels. You will remember that we started this app by setting the debug environment variable to express HBS : star. So by that you can probably guess that this debug module supports wildcards, which it does. And for further information, just go to npmjs.org and look at the documentation for the debug module. HTTP on the next line here is a core module, part of Node. And so what we'll see here, so we created this and configured this Express object inside of app here. And we'll see, okay, we're just picking up a little bit of information from the environment about the ports. This process.env here, that's the way that inside a Node program you would inspect the values of environment variables. So if you were to write some code in here that said process.env.debug, you would see the debug value that we set in the environment before we ran this program. And that's how the debug module is reading that. And of course, if you don't specify a port, it uses 3000. We saw that when we ran the app before. We went to localhost :3000. Alright, so it just tells the app to listen on that port. And here we're using, again, this is Node's built-in HTTP module and create server, and we pass in that app object that's exported by Express. And then the rest is just saying, okay, start listening, and this is just wiring up some events. If you're not familiar with Node, Node has another sort of built-in base utility. If you're coming from a language with classical inheritance, you'd think of it as a class, and it's called an event emitter, and just supports basic publishing of events and subscribing to events. So that's what this on is doing. It's subscribing to the error event and the listening event. And down here you can see the handlers for those. And the one place where the debug function that we initialized up top is being used is right here. So you may remember that when we started up the app, we saw it was saying listening on port 3000. Alright, so that's all there is to this file. As I said, the guts are in the app.js, so we're going to take a look at that next. Now we're going to walk through the app.js file. So we're just going to start at the top, and you can see we start out by loading Express. Obviously, that's what we're using. Path is another core Node module, and we're going to see it used throughout the rest of this file, basically just to resolve some path names and set some absolute paths. Fav Icon, okay, so Fav Icon is a Node module that you can get from npm, and you can configure it to have your Express site serve up a Fav icon that most browsers will then display in the tab or bookmark. I might get around to showing how to configure this, maybe not, but if not, just go ahead and look up the documentation on npm. Alright, the logger, it's using Morgan here, and Morgan is a bit of logging middleware for Express, so that actually opens up a couple different questions. Number one, what is middleware? And I'm going to get to that in a minute. Actually, I guess that's really the only question it opens up, isn't it? But just real quickly, Morgan is the piece of middleware that was responsible for showing the actual HTTP verbs and routes and response times and HTTP status codes on the console as the Express app is running. So that's actually not coming from debug, that's coming from Morgan. Alright, then we got a cookie parser and a body parser. Those are also npm modules, and they do kind of what you'd think they do. They enable Express to parse HTTP cookies and bodies of requests into JavaScript objects. So I'll talk a little bit more about those in a sec. Then we got, these are two routers, routes index and routes users. So I'll talk about those also soon. But this is sort of, if you're coming from an ASP.NET background, an Express router could be thought of to be sort of similar to a controller. So generally speaking, a router will hold a collection of URLs under a path and take different actions depending on the actual route matched and the HTTP verb. Alright, so here we are going to create an app object and construct it with the express function. And the first thing we do is we're setting the path, so we're using the path module, and this __ dir name is a global in Node, and it just is a value that represents the path that the app is running at. So this is the current app. So we're using path.join to say to create a path with the location plus the views folder. So we're setting the location of the views folder. So you can see in here we have .hbs files, and those are handlebars files. And in the next line, we're actually setting the view engine to HBS. So app.set is Express's way of sort of configuring the app object or the Express object to for its different behaviors. And the things that you can configure are documented in Express's documentation. So I'm not going to pull it all up here. I'm just going to explain what this file is doing with the options that it's using. So when it says that HBS is the view engine, that actually tells Express two things. Number one, it says that it's going to be using a node module named HBS, and it's also saying that views whose extensions end in HBS are going to be rendered by that module. So you're going to see that in both places. All right. Let's have a quick look at the views real quick. Okay, so handlebars has the concept of partial views and layouts, and it uses sort of a convention-based way of resolving which layout it's going to use. And in this sample app here, there's only one layout, so this is sort of like the default layout. And you can see it's basically just like HTML, just using the sort of the handlebars or mustache bracket notation to embed various kinds of content in here. So here we're embedding a title, and then this this triple bracket notation here means that other content is going to get embedded into there. So we've got one view for index and another view for error, and we'll see how those are going to get used in a minute. Alright, so logger. Logger was Morgan up here, and that's that logging middleware I was talking about. So, and middleware is mounted using app.use. So let's talk for a second about what middleware is. Middleware, you can kind of think of it, again, coming from ASP.NET, you can think of it as a request filter. So it's something that gets executed before every request, and actually actually I shouldn't say before, it's actually executed in the order that they're loaded. So the fact that you know, like these things are loaded before the routes down here is very significant, and you're going to see why in a moment. But for now, just realize that, you know, every piece of middleware that gets loaded, it's actually going to have a signature just like this right here, because we see app.use here. So every middleware gets access to the request object. The response object is that second one, and then next, which actually represents the next middleware in the chain. Normally, you call next with no parameters to just indicate, okay, now execute the next middleware, or you can pass in an error object, and then Express will skip the rest of the request processing chain and start processing error handlers, which I'll get to later. So right here, it's just loading the Morgan middleware, passing in the dev parameter, which controls the format of the output. And again, if you go to npmjs.com and look up the Morgan package, you'll see all of the different formats that are available for you there. Then next, it's loading some body parsers. So this one here is a body parser that lets Express parse and understand a JSON body and parse it into JavaScript object. Then we have another one that this one can parse URL encoded. So that means like if you do post a form to the Express app, then it will parse the URL encoded form values into a JavaScript object that'll be available inside the request object. And then we have the cookie parser, which, as you might expect, parses out the cookie and makes it available again in the request object. Then we have here, this is the one piece of middleware that actually comes out of the box in Express, which is serving static files. So express.static, and the first parameter here is telling what the base of the directories are for static files. So in here, it's public. So that means that if we were to navigate to, say we had an image in here called, falafel.jpg, then if you navigated to localhost :3000 /images/falafel.jpg, then you would see that image. So, and that's how you get like, you see, okay, so here's a style sheets with style.css, and you can see in the layout over here, there's that href, which is starting at, this is the root, style sheets, style.css. So you can see that this, this public folder is like the root for all the static, all of the static content for the website. All right, and then we're loading up the routers here. And like I said before, order of loading of routes is explicit and important, because if you have multiple routes that can match a request when they come in, then the first route that matches that request will handle it. Unless it actually, there are ways for routes to not end the request or the response. So in that case, it could maybe pass through to another one. Once that is done, now note what happens here, okay? If a request gets this far, it has not matched any routes. So at this point, we're saying, okay, we're going to explicitly create an error, not found, set the status to 404, and call next with that error object. So now, you might be wondering, do you have to do this manually? Doesn't Express do this already? It kind of does. If you comment this out, and you make a request to something that doesn't exist, you still get a 404, and you get like a not found, like sort of a very generic not found. But doing it this way lets you sort of take more control over the process, and that's what you can see next here in the error handlers. Express detects the development versus production environments a little bit differently from most other Node modules that I've seen in my limited time working in the Node ecosystem. It seems like more of the standard is to actually look at process.env.node_env. That's what many things will use. But Express is a special snowflake. It does it this way. Of course, this is your code. You could change this to look at node-env instead. So no reason why you couldn't. So let's talk about what's happening here. You can see it's still app use, so that means it's still middleware being mounted here. But notice now how there's 4 arguments instead of 3, and that's actually really significant, because when a piece of middleware takes 4 arguments instead of 3, that's what tells Express this is an error handling piece of middleware. So you'll see, like for example, next is actually never used inside these functions. And that's pretty common, but you still need to put it in the function list, because Express uses the cardinality, which is a fancy word for the number of arguments of the function, to figure out if it's an error handler or not. So you always have to do this anyways. Just as the comments say, if it's a development environment, then it's actually going to render a view, the error view, and show the stack trace, or if it's production, then it will not render the stack trace. So that's actually pretty nice, probably something that you'll want to do anyway, so it's nice that they did that for you. And if we go back, so let's take a look at res.render real quick. So res.render is how Express renders views. So you give it a view name right there. Notice there's no suffix here. We're just going to use the error view, and then this is the data we're going to render. So there's a message and an error. So now if we go over to error.hbs, we can see, oh, look, there's error, there's message, and there's error.status, and there's error.stack. So that shows you kind of like right out of the gate. That's sort of the basic way that an Express app uses a view model and a template to bring them together and render output that is then go back to the client. So if we were to fire that up, fire that back up, and we'll bring in a tab, and we'll go to, let's try going to ASP.NET. That shouldn't be found, right? So there's your 404 not found, and here's that error message, and the status, and here's the stack trace. So that can be a nice way to pretty quickly find out what's going on with your app. And we already saw before that if you just go to the root like so, there's your welcome to Express. And if we're to look at the root, it's rendering index with the title Express, and there's their index view, and boom, there's the title and welcome to Express. So that's the basics of how the scaffolded application is wired up, and you can see that the skeleton is already there. So just like with an ASP.NET application, you already have like a models folder and a views folder and a controllers folder, and you know, okay, I put my controllers there, put my views there, my models there, and the structure is already in place. Well, you have a similar structure here. There's no models folder here. You could put one here if you want, and then you could export factory functions that create objects that will always have the same format if you wanted to do that. Although you might find it to be like a little bit of extra overhead. It's something that you kind of are used to doing or have to do in a strongly typed language. But, you know, in a language like JavaScript, where you can sort of throw around objects willy-nilly and not worry about classes or types so much, you don't have to. So unless there's a benefit to you where you need to reuse the same object shapes in multiple places, maybe you don't want a models folder like you would be used to in ASP.NET. Next, I'm going to show how to implement your own router and capture some information from the request, both in the route and in the query string and in the body, and how we can use that in the body of the request and then send a response.